Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have two very special guests returning to talk about another of their books. I've had them back for two conversations talking about a recent publication titled Invoking the Beyond, the Kantian Rift, Mythologized Menaces, and the Quest for the New Man, published 2020. It's Philip and Paul Collins. But I've listened to an interview and I've read through their book, an earlier book that they published. There's an updated version from 2006. Title of the book is The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, an examination of epistemic autocracy from the 19th to the 21st century. And it really traces the kind of beginnings of where we're at today, going back a couple centuries. I remember listening to their interview. I think it was on Visigoth, and just going, yeah, man, these guys are really getting what's this kind of notion of progress, which really isn't progress to our current day and our current science. I would say we're in a scientific dictatorship right now. So they can talk more about that. So Philip and Paul, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having us, William.
Yeah, thanks, William.
Awesome. Well, for people who may not have heard our earlier two discussions about Invoking the Beyond, this is your earlier book. Can you kind of talk about your backgrounds and what led you to this first title, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship?
Okie dokie. Well, with the Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, it actually began, the thesis began to take shape during my college years. I have a bachelor's degree in communication studies with an emphasis on print journalism. I have also a bachelor's degree in liberal studies with an emphasis on literature. And I have, by the way, this is Philip Collins. I should have specified before I start talking. And I also have a minor in philosophy. And in the course of my philosophy studies, we came across one particular topic that, invariably surfaces, and that is the question of science and religion. And it was during taking that course that the thesis for the Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship actually took shape, because I saw this very vaunted assessment of the abilities of science. I saw this extremely inflated investment of confidence in science, and then of course that inflated assessment resulted in an extrapolation of the practices of science into the realm of governance, and that is what gives rise to a technocracy, what can be called a technocracy, or as Aldous Huxley called it in Brave New World, a scientific dictatorship. But a technocracy is really just the appellation assigned to a system of governance wherein technical and scientific experts rule by virtue of their specialized knowledge. The experts occupy lofty positions in political institutions and economic institutions because they allegedly possess some vaguely defined gnosis or secret knowledge concerning the operations of the natural order. But the contention that scientists should seize the reins of governance rests upon scientism, which was what I was just previously describing. Scientism is the epistemological conviction that the investigational methods of the natural sciences can be applied to all fields of inquiry. Scientism holds that the natural sciences provide the only legitimate hermeneutical keys for understanding the world and reality. In short, it's epistemological imperialism. Through the prism of an exclusively scientific outlook, all other forms of knowledge that cannot be derived through quantitative and empirical methods are regarded as unreliable at best or illusory at worst. So philosophical, metaphysical, religious claims, all of those are automatically dismissed because they cannot be scientifically apprehended. In short, science is deemed the sole path to truth. But this is a problem because the question is raised, are the natural sciences the only means by which knowledge in any field can be sought? And again, the natural sciences, they must concern themselves only with what is quantifiably and empirically demonstrable. And these epistemic constraints raises questions about the universal competence of the natural sciences. There are several things that cannot be scientifically proven, but they're perfectly rational to accept. For instance, metaphysical truths, such as the authenticity of the external world or the existence of minds apart from our own, that cannot be scientifically proven. But nevertheless, such metaphysical truths are perfectly rational beliefs to hold. This is especially true for the belief in the authenticity of the external world, which is the chief object of scientific research. Mathematical and logical truths, those cannot be proven by the natural sciences. Such truths are presupposed by the natural sciences. Therefore, attempts to prove them scientifically, that just amounts to fruitless exercises in circular argumentation. Ethical beliefs, those cannot be scientifically proven. Uh, uh, the the natural sciences make descriptive claims about the world. It tells us things like water is wet, rock is hard. They're descriptive claims. Whether a descriptive claim is true or false is an empirical question. On the other hand, ethical claims are prescriptive or normative. They deal with things as they ought to be, not with things as they are. The natural sciences can describe historical atrocities like the Holocaust, but they cannot offer an evaluative judgment concerning crimes against humanity. In fact, an exclusively scientific outlook cannot identify any given transgression as a crime against humanity because it cannot establish the intrinsic values of human beings. In the words of B.F. Skinner, science dehomunculizes man. Man used to be this being that was originally defended by the literatures of freedom and dignity, but now he's dehomunculized. He's almost bestialized. And not surprisingly, Richard Dawkins, the famous new atheist, who believes that science can supply a tenable ethic, has argued that the demarcations between humans and animals are more, in his words, more fuzzy and less clear cut. But most significantly, science itself cannot be scientifically proven. Science is replete with unverifiable assumptions. Again, science assumes that all sensory information provides a reliable portrait of external reality. Science also assumes that physical laws are ubiquitous and are applicable everywhere. Science also assumes that there are perceptible regularities that one can expect to observe should the requisite conditions hold sway. None of these assumptions can be scientifically proven, yet they are accepted by most scientists. The epistemic constraints of science become especially pronounced when it is extrapolated to the context of governance, and this gives rise to technocracy or a scientific dictatorship. A dangerous assumption of technocracy is that scientists are somehow immune to ideological biases and dubious influences. When institutionally accredited science is fetishized, as it has been, especially here in the West, with the recent COVID hysteria, which has basically resulted in my opinion, the destruction of science and the destruction of the credibility of most scientists. Okay,
I just kept thinking of Fauci as I was reading through your book. Like
absolutely,
the names kept popping up.
Absolutely. When accredited science is fetishized in that manner, there is this general tendency to assume that those theoreticians, like Fauci, who have secured the blessing of the state, are good scientists, quote unquote, while any critics, any detractors are regarded as anti-scientific.
Right, and he's the priest of this. It's so important that your book points him out perfectly as like this representation of science, capital S. He stated, "I am science," and literally yesterday he came out and said, "We don't think this should be put through the stuff that we do at the CDC should put through courts of law." So he's stating that the courts of law can have no effect, which is an absolute joke. Courts of law have effect on everybody. So
and that's the
he's saying he's above the law,
right? And that's the scientific prism, because principles such as justice are not quantifiably and empirically demonstrable, they have no place. They have no place in the scientific outlook. And so if you apply this rigidly scientific outlook, as Fauci does, to the to governance and to how a pandemic is managed, justice and human rights, they are regarded completely and totally inconsequential. They're completely and totally irrelevant because they are not quantifiably and empirically demonstrable. And so because he is science, and he basically said as much,
Right.
and that
And it's the questioning of the proles. The people cannot question his determination of what is science when it's pretty clear for somebody with critical analytical skills, they've shaped this whole event to the
Right.
benefit of a technocratic class.
Right. And we've gotten that a lot. A lot of people have been saying, when we read your book, that the first thing that comes to our mind is Anthony Fauci. And yes, Fauci is the most blatant out of the closet technocrats, but he's not the first. My background is a bachelor's in political science, so I looked at this from the standpoint of political science, because it's in politics that we see the existential consequences of the whole concept of a technocracy. I mean, but before many of us knew who Anthony Fauci was, you had individuals like Larry Summers, who was an economist. He's still an economist. He's still alive. He was I believe, Secretary of the Treasury at one time. He was president of Harvard University at one time. Harvard University, by the way, is an epicenter of technocratic thought and thinking. Larry Summers was one of the major architects of the post-Soviet Russian economy, and he tried to play like he was this dispassionate kind of economist who just came at it from an opinion-free kind of perspective. But then you look at the plan that he laid out for Russia. It included this. It was called privatization, but the name that was given to it by its critics was briberization. Where these national leaders were offered, like loans by the IMF or the World Banks, but the loans really amounted to little bit more than bribes to have them sell off state industries. And this is what happened in Russia, and it obviously was a part. The plan, this briberization, obviously was characterized by partiality, because it allowed Western elites to colonize Russia. And so, this went on for many, many years. It led to Russia being, split into basically the haves and the have-nots. The average, Russian really didn't own anything. Life expectancy took a huge
Right. The life expectancy went down. The average Russian died at 55 or 57, something incredible like that.
Yeah, if you were 45, you were an old man.
Right.
It just went off a steep cliff, and it really didn't get off of this. It didn't, get off of this track until Yeltsin, appointed Putin, and I don't think that it's any exaggeration to say that the war with Ukraine right now is in part because of technocracy. It's basically an attempt to try to get Russia back on the technocratic track. And but another very technocratic individual, I believe around 1972, I would say, 71, 72, when Salvador Allende was ousted in Chile in favor of Augusto Pinochet, who was basically an American puppet. During a meeting of the 40 Committee, which was this committee that basically oversaw covert action and the like, Henry Kissinger was there. And to paraphrase him loosely, he said, "I don't think we should let the country slip into communism because the people voted for that." Well, and that's a loose paraphrase, but that's capturing it accurately. So basically, he's saying
he's promoting the circumvention of democratic practices because he recognized the fact that perhaps the voters were not going to vote in a way that he and his fellow experts deemed desirable.
Right. Sounds like the 2020 election, but that's
yeah.
But that was the original 9/11. So that was 9/11, 1972.
Yeah. Now, and these were other technocrats or people with technocratic mindsets who were also theoreticians and retainers for oligarchs, for covert political circles, and for the oligarchs that exist above those political circles. They were more subtle than Anthony Fauci. Anthony Fauci is someone who lacks any subtlety, and he's out of the closet with his technocratic thinking.
Right, no question. And I thought it was really fascinating. You started, or the intro to your book has a quote from Eisenhower's farewell address, and everybody heard the story of the, what is it, the military-industrial complex from that speech. But he also warned about the scientific technological elite. So if I can quote that, it says, "Yet, in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite." That speech is so important.
That's extremely important. And the problem is that with the simple bestowal of this one mystified appellation of scientist, all of a sudden a theoretician's rendered as virtually immune to venality, to immorality, to irrationality. Oh no, they're men of science. They would never ever succumb to the darker impulses of humanity. But of course, if the theoreticians of institutionally accredited science are unquestionably virtuous, then their opponents must be either ignorant or just malevolent. And this sort of antagonistic binary closely resembles the distinct Gnostic dialectic of the pneumatikoi, who are the saved because they are enlightened, and the sukeikoi, who are the damned because they are ignorant. And such elitism invariably follows when science is esteemed as a veritable gnosis. At any rate, though, if so-called men of science are not immune to immorality, to irrationality, to venality, then it stands to reason that they may not be immune to even darker impulses. Among those impulses are libido dominandi, the desire to dominate others. And you see this desire on display during a talk delivered by none other than Anthony Fauci at the Washington National Cathedral on November 12th, 2020. Yeah, 2020. Fauci said, here, let me read this verbatim for the editor.
Very important. So he's at the National Cathedral, giving these speeches. So he's taken the place of the minister. Wow.
Yes.
And that's the theme of your book.
Yes. He says, I was talking with my UK colleagues who are saying the UK is similar to where we are now because each of our countries have that independent spirit. I can understand that, but now is the time to do what you're told. Unquote.
Oh, incredible.
The autocratic mentality permeating that statement is hardly subtle. Fauci also acknowledged during that talk that scientists, they're now being perceived as authoritarian during the pandemic, and that unfortunately science has, in his words, been lumped into politics. Well, this statement betrays Fauci's rather technocratic assumption that scientists constitute some stock of apolitical overmen, immune to political and ideological biases. The fact is that the prescriptions chronically presented by Fauci comport with totalitarianism of the left-wing persuasion. The conflation of science with politics is not attributable to public sentiment. Instead, the public has identified the political and ideological biases motivating Fauci's evaluative judgments. And more importantly, people have identified Fauci's barely concealed lust to overcome and conquer others. And again, that those biases have always been there.
They've always been there. I mean, again, returning to Larry Summers and to the privatization plan that he had in Russia, and it was partial to Western institutions and to Western corporations and to Communist Party members over there that were willing to play ball and, as a matter of political survivalism, switch sides and came over to Western, covert political circles and began to bequeath, certain parts of national industry to themselves, take what was owned by the state and give it to themselves as private monopolies.
Okay.
And it was obviously partial. There was no unbiased kind of thinking, but that energized what Larry Summers was doing. And in Chile, again with Henry Kissinger, and they were motivated by a technical frame of mind. When Augusto Pinochet was brought in, who did that end up benefiting? ITT, Anaconda Copper, PepsiCo, all these companies that had everything to lose if somebody like Allende had came in and had a nationalized industry.
Well, Allende did nationalize the copper mine, the huge copper mine there that was owned by I can't remember what family. The Guggenheim family owned it.
Yeah,
they were one of the people to make sure that overthrow happened. It was a lot about money.
Yeah, but the overthrow had just undying. I mean, a overwhelming favoritism of American corporate interest. So I mean, this idea that these technocrats are just dispassionate and they're not bringing their opinions into anything is absolute hogwash.
Yeah. Good point. Right.
Good point. With scientism, then the epistemological conviction that the investigational methods of science can be applied to all fields of inquiry. Okay, with that you find a transposition of the Gnostic belief in gnosis or secret knowledge. You see a transposition of gnosis into the immanent sphere, particularly in this case with technocracy, into a socio-political context. The only difference is where the Gnostics of antiquity elevated the transcendent to the detriment of the immanent and regarded all of the material cosmos as a deceptive simulacrum, as ontologically deficient. The neo-Gnostics of scientism elevate the immanent to the detriment of the transcendent and esteem the physical cosmos and the material world as the sole reality. The interesting thing, though, the interesting dialectical commonality to note between this new Gnosticism and the old Gnosticism is that both actively denigrate matter. As a matter of fact, as science has advanced, we see it becoming increasingly allergic to matter, increasingly hostile to matter. And why is that? Well, what animates the thinking of scientific materialists? A dysteleological view of the cosmos, the view of the cosmos as purposeless and meaningless. And this is the exact same dysteleological view taken by the Gnostics. But arguably, the theoretician who introduced this dysteleology to science was none other than Sir Francis Bacon, an English Renaissance philosopher and statesman. On the Baconian outlook, history was defined by the growth and development of science and technology. Bacon basically supplanted Plato's philosopher kings, those who could discern the forms of social justice, with a technical elite who governed according to the principles of technical order and efficiency. Bacon advanced a societal arrangement, a very technocratic societal arrangement in the New Atlantis, which was a subtly prescriptive piece of literature that presented readers with this purely technocratic society, this utopia that was ran by scientists and technicians. And one of the core assumptions upon which the Baconian societal model was premised was that the cosmos was bereft of a telos, or an end goal. Telos is etymologically the etymological root of the philosophical term teleology, which is the study of purposiveness in the universe. Teleology concerns itself with the purposes and ultimate ends of natural things. But Bacon, when Bacon pretty much rose to prominence with the scientific method, he expunged teleology. He basically relegated teleology to the realm of theology, said it had no place in scientific studies. But Bacon was among one of the first theoreticians who would expunge purposiveness and meaning from scientific studies. Though he certainly was not a scientist of great consequence, Bacon distinguished himself as the first promoter, organizer, and propagandist for science as a perpetual institution. Before science was subjected to dysteleological revisions, it was a quasi-spiritual contemplation of the essences and intrinsic motives of things.
Right, it's changed. It's changed over time.
Right. The discipline of science, it initially presupposed the intelligibility of the cosmos. And that presupposition was well-founded, because if the cosmos was not intelligible, then a scientist's efforts to understand the natural order would be futile. If the unintelligible remains immune to meaningful study and apprehension, if unintelligibility is a ubiquitous feature of the universe, then the interpretive instruments of science are completely useless. A dysteleological cosmos possesses no meaning. Instead, a dysteleological cosmos would be, by definition, meaningless. Ironically, the discernment of the meaning of the natural order's various mechanisms is a chief vocation of science. But at any rate, Bacon believed that the nature could be forced to reveal her secrets through systematic experimentation once teleology had been completely rejected. And this rejection would significantly alter the ends to which many scientific enterprises were directed. To understand the ramification of teleology's exile from science, one has to first understand the relationship between science and metaphysics. Metaphysics is prior to science. Errant metaphysics and errant metaphysical propositions typically presage science going awry. When raw scientific data is decoupled from a legitimate metaphysical framework, you have ideological biases introducing themselves, and they're given carte blanche. Bacon's rejection of teleology in favor of a mechanical interpretation of nature was the metaphysical error that gave rise to much of the misguided science that we see throughout the 20th and the 21st century. Naturally, the rejection of teleology would change the metaphysical framework guiding scientific research. And in the case of Bacon, that rejection permitted him to enshrine a metaphysical framework that accommodated a mechanistic view of nature. And in turn, this view probably stemmed from certain esoteric beliefs that Bacon had imbibed within more esoteric orders. For instance, Bacon was a member of a secret society called the Order of the Helmet, and the organization's name was inspired by Pallas Athene, the Greek goddess of wisdom, who was portrayed wearing a helmet. And the order had this rather fetishized view of wisdom that echoed the Gnostic conception of Sophia, who represented an agency of gnosis. And appropriately enough, Bacon was also a student of Hermetic, Neoplatonist, and Gnostic philosophy, and he had also studied the Kabbalah. All of these schools of occultism proffered their own iterations of gnosis. But you see with Bacon the transposition of gnosis into the Mannus sphere. And with the transposition of that gnosis into the Mannus sphere, we see matter being depicted as infinitely malleable, and just a standing reserve of flexible material, a Bestand, as Heidegger put it. And that's how the ruling elite are now treating the physical world. It's nothing more than a block of clay, of malleable material for them to mold. And you see
Right.
this, and that's equally applicable to human beings who are part of that
Right.
standing reserve. The anthropological assumption of the elite is that there is a human plasticity, and that plasticity allows them to reshape and remold us, as is evidenced by, for instance, the Great Reset. Now we are told you will own nothing and you will be
You'll
happy.
be happy, right? But that's not the first time they've been. You could say the mighty Wurlitzer, the whole Operation what is it? What's the operation where the Mockingbird? Like they've been manipulating people, at least here in the States. And you could actually make the argument that Francis Bacon was really one of the first technocrats at first. I mean, and you wrote in your book, like he wrote the New Atlantis, which is about an ideal technocratically led society, right?
That's absolutely correct. And then Henri de Saint-Simon, who was an 18th century French utopian socialist, his work was considered the prescription for Bacon's prophecy in the New Atlantis. And he advanced what he called a new Christianity, which basically offered morality without metaphysics and technology without theology.
Can
And
you go back and explain who Henri de Saint-Simon was and where he grew up and where he got his ideas and what time he was from?
he was from the 18th century, and he was a utopian socialist, a French utopian socialist. And the interesting thing about him, and this again shows us a distinct continuity of thought from Bacon to Henri de Saint-Simon, is that with his new Christianity, he basically suggested that it resemble heretical Christian sects of the past. And of course, there's little doubt that among those heretical sects were the Gnostics. And so we have again this Gnostically inspired theoretician. Um, um, but
But he grew up, went through the French Revolution, right?
yes, he
So he
went.
experienced that. He was in the Reign of Terror.
Yes, he
And
was
that's a
in,
very important thing for the socialists and Marx.
right
They always
because
go back to the French Revolution, but there was a very serious dark side. And
right.
Robespierre was no saint. He was
No,
going
he
to
was
kill
not.
a lot of people, right?
And yes, and the interesting thing is that Henri de Saint-Simon was imprisoned for a time there and actually feared being executed. And so his belief was that be there had to be a way to channel the forces of revolution before they could uh, before they could become far too anarchistic to control. And so that's what he hoped. That's what he hoped to do through his new Christianity, was to channel the forces of revolution, but to not end in such an anarchistic bloodbath as one sees in the at the nadir of the French Revolution.
Right. And his idea was he didn't want to have another revolution. So his ideas were almost a precursor to Huxley's scientific dictatorship, right?
Right.
Some ways.
Yes, right. He advanced a governmental arrangement dubbed the administrative state. And while this appellation sounds rather mundane, what you find on closer examination is that there's this belief that human reason incarnates the divine, animating this idea of the administrative state. At least that would be the case for the scientists and technicians who constituted Saint Simon's secular priesthood. One could argue that Saint Simon was little more than a neo-Gnostic theocrat who declared a new scientific faith to post-revolutionary France. In fact, the Librarian of Congress, James A. Billington, he described Saint Simon as a John the Baptist of revolutionary ideology, crying out in the wilderness of the Napoleonic Restoration eras for new historicism and moral relativism. So Saint Simon's mission was a distinctly religious one. Having experienced the tumult of the French Revolution, Saint Simon was painfully acquainted with the chaos stemming from institutional religions complete and total ouster. So he realized that the amputation of the church from the state was analogous to the removal of the soul from the body. The soulless state was an indiscriminate murder, as was evidenced by the government of revolutionary France. The irony is that in hopes of subduing those fires of revolution, Saint-Simon actually provided the theoretical basis for more destructive revolutions. In fact, one of the most destructive revolutions of them all. Saint-Simon hoped to bring an end to revolution by promoting a science of human relations. And to do that, he drew upon the radical empiricism of Destutt Tracy and extended that rigid epistemology into the new field of social relations. And in so doing, he enshrined a strictly quantitative approach to government. And arguably, this epistemology of governance would constitute a new gnosis for the aspiring elites of the subsequent centuries. Suddenly, science promised explanatory unity concerning human relations, and those in possession of the gnosis only needed to apply the proper economic and social stimuli to induce desirable mass behaviors. But Saint-Simon applied the scientific method to the body of society, and he analyzed it according to its physiological components. And the physiological components of society are classes. And if that sounds familiar, that's because this presaged the functional class analysis of Marxist class theory, which presented the eschatological hope of a classless socialist utopia. And a defining feature of this secularized Eden was the absence of social distinctions. Just as the Gnostic believed that ontological distinctions were symptomatic of matters corrupting influence, the Marxists believed that social distinctions bodied forth evil. And so, in order to homogenize humanity, classes had to be obliterated. And we all know where that led, because the Black Book of Communism is replete with just atrocity on top of atrocity. So it's ironic that Henri de Saint-Simon was hoping to put an end to revolution when he actually helped to birth a new one that just went on perpetually.
But Saint-Simonian thought is, you can see it even today with the Davos set, with the World Economic Forum, which again is, another one of these oligarchical institutions pushing for a kind of global technocratic order of sorts, because again, go back to what they said in that promo, you'll own nothing and you will be happy. Well, if you own nothing, property ownership is one of the ways of making distinctions between people and classes. To eliminate class, you get rid of ownership. Right. And so so you have the Saint-Simonian themes running through
the fetish with the homogenization of humanity.
Right. So you see that and I think you wrote Saint-Simon also influenced his physiological analyses of society, influenced Ernst Haeckel, who took his ideas from Huxley and then put it into Nazi German doctrine, right?
Yes, Nazi German doctrine. Ernst Haeckel was basically Hitler's mentor in social Darwinism. And also the Saint-Simon also basically not only influenced, but he was he was the mentor of none other than Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte, of course, being the founding father of the social sciences, of sociology, but he built on the ideas of Henri de Saint-Simon and advanced the development of a surrogate religion, an idea that Saint-Simon had contemplated a great deal. Now, where Saint-Simon proposed a new Christianity, which was basically just a syncretistic hodgepodge of heretical ideas, of the ideas from heretical sects, Comte promoted the concept of a sociocracy, which could be described as a new religion of humanity. A sociocracy would be enshrined through what Comte dubbed sociolatry, which is basically a combination of two words, sociology and idolatry. Sociology or sociolatry, as it was defined by Comte, involved a system of secularized sacraments and festivals. Comte believed that through this system of devotional rites, participants would consecrate themselves to humanity, and humanity was venerated as the great being. So you have this divinization of humanity, this apotheosization of humanity, incarnating itself throughout history as great historical figures. In fact, adherents of Comte's religion believed that all humans, dead and alive, comprised this grand being. But of course, the worship of humanity, whether under the appellation of the grand being or some other designation, qualifies as just another form of autotheism. With Comte's grand being, one discerns intimations of the Gnostic pleroma, albeit in an ammanitized form. Like his Gnostic antecedents, Comte believed that the human essence once commingled with divine essence inside a singular deific power. In fact, Comte's grand being represented a far more radical formulation of autotheism because it was exclusively composed of the entire human race. Man did not simply exist in ontological union with the divine, but collectively constituted it as an apotheosized species. And within this framework of Comte's theocracy, the governing priesthood of this intramundane divinity would be social scientists. And throughout London and other major cities, Comtean churches devoted to this religion would begin to actually pop up.
Wow, that's incredible. That's surprising. And this whole idea, the scientific dictatorship, was supposed to be kind of, you could say the Nazis were materialistic scientific dictatorship, and the Bolsheviks, right? In a lot of ways, they thought that they were bringing, definitely under Stalin, I would say it was a scientific dictatorship. They were trying to bring in their kind of new man / utopia, right?
That's absolutely correct. Yes. Yes.
And can you go back to the beginning? Like, you talk about how Masonry led to Darwinism, which led to Marx and Hitler. Can you talk about the beginnings of how, I found it very interesting how the ideas of Masonry are very similar, if not overlap, into Darwinism. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, Darwinism, of course, it's Wolfgang Smith, who basically characterized Darwinism as a Gnostic myth because it dignified the metaphysical claim of self-creation with it dignified the soteriological claim of self-salvation with the metaphysical claim of self-creation. Species just spontaneously generated themselves, and obviously a natural order that gives rise to itself, that makes itself and perpetuates itself, constitutes really on a tacit level a deific force itself. It constitutes an intramundane divinity. But such an intramundane divinity was also revered by the Freemasons. They revered such an intramundane divinity in the form of the great architect. But the work of Darwin was promoted by this inner circle within the British Royal Society, which was largely a Masonic organization in its inception. But within the British Royal Society was this organization known as the X Club, which was presided over by T.H. Huxley, who was a Freemason, and also gathered together several other Masons into its fold. It was characterized by Adrian Desmond and James Moore as a hidden Masonic Darwinian lodge. And it was through the X Club that Darwin's work enjoyed promotion. And what was most expedient about Darwin's theory was the anthropological assumptions underpinning it. And that is, again, that human beings exhibit infinite plasticity, are completely malleable, bereft of any sort of ontological fixity. the human being may one day evolve into something other than human. And so that was a presupposition held by many of the social revolutions, as well as man being infinitely mutable, infinitely changeable. And that's the same, that you see that same anthropological assumption underpinning the present the present technocratic order being enshrined, the present technocratic order being enshrined today, for instance, through the Great Reset.
Right. So it all built up. So you see this same idea. Man is malleable. Everything's changing. It is interesting. I found that Marx went to a Huxley lecture and loved Darwinism. And you can kind of see that. So this whole notion of progress goes from the internal doctrines of Masonry into Darwinism, into the inevitable, triumph of communism and Hitler's outlook, right? So those ideas all have their genealogy back there, to really,
There's certainly a lineage there. I believe Erasmus Darwin was even a Freemason, or he was associated with the Freemasonic Lodge. There were allegations that he was part. So you had that influence there. That at least on an unconscious level, Charles was probably imbibing all these Masonic notions from his grandfather, and that was having an impact on his quote unquote scientific ventures, whether it be what he was writing or his time at the Galapagos Islands, where he was really just imposing this idea of mutability on what he saw at the Galapagos Islands.
Right. Erasmus Darwin was also a member of the Lunar Society, and the Lunar Society referred to themselves as merchants of light. And that was a phrase they borrowed straight from Bacon. And also the Lunar Society with Erasmus Darwin, he was a proponent of the French Revolution and a supporter of the radical Jacobins. And there is some scholarly work showing that there was a possibility that Erasmus Darwin was also an admirer of Adam Weishaupt, who, of course, was the founder of the infamous Bavarian Illuminati.
Right. And so the Illuminati had that same idea, too. Didn't you say the inner Areopagites or whatever? Something like that?
Yeah, the Areopagites. The Illuminati believed that that there was no God in the beginning, but that God would surface in the end, and God would be humanity in toto. So again, you had this idea of the mutability of man, and that man begins as this kind of reactive animal, and that through the enshrinement of reason, he's gradually brought to apotheosis.
Right. And so that in Robespierre, there was definitely an Illuminist influence in the French Revolution, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I can't remember. It was Mirabeau, Count Mirabeau. Some people believe that he brought Illuminism back to France, and that it was through Count Mirabeau that Illuminism found its way into the more radical factions of the revolutionaries, in particular the Jacobins, who were probably the most violent of the sects, of the factions in that revolution.
Right. And you mentioned what Professor Robeson, who wrote Proofs of a Conspiracy in 1979, right after the revolution, really, or even during the French Revolution. He was brought in and pretty much exposed a lot of the Illuminist ideas, right?
Well, he had actually, I believe, ran afoul of Illuminist when he was with the Royal Society. I believe it was, and he had ran into this pernicious strain of Illuminized Masonry when he was in the Royal Society, and that's what compelled him to write that book.
I see. And I think that was it. I think the argument was, and I don't quote me on this, but that the Illuminists infiltrated the Masonic lodges of France and change them, and that's supposedly how they influenced the revolution. I
Yeah,
have to go back and research my stuff.
yeah, and you know, that's what's always been understood, but it should also be realized that many Masons, you know, now today just regard Weishaupt to have been a Masonic reformer. So he was basically cleaning up Masonry and getting it off the back on track. You know, that's the way he's kind of regarded. He's regarded today. I've noticed that, you know, he's not seen as the madman that he was anymore, as much as he was kind of an innovator, a reformer. That's how he's kind of seen in these secret society circles today now, a misunderstood genius of sorts.
I see. Well, there's a lot more in this book. I mean, we're at 50 minutes. I got to wrap it up at 60. Do you have time for a few questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Bill Doggy asked you to, can your guests get into the theories of Thomas Malthus and how they serve the autocracy?
Yeah, sure. So, Thomas Malthus's the statistical research really informed much of the research of Charles Darwin, and kind of acted as an affirmation of Darwin's rather Hobbesian notion of the kingdom of nature being a war to the hilt, a war of all against all. It really affirmed the otherwise tautological phrase "survival of the fittest." But with Thomas Malthus, he was a defrocked Anglican priest, and he had advanced a theory of population based on a very spurious set of propositions. And that spurious set of propositions was subsistence production. It basically multiplies at an arithmetic rate of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And meanwhile, population, it increases at a geometric rate, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And so on this thesis, according to these two spurious sets of propositions, he arrived at the thesis that invariably population growth would exceed the capabilities of subsistence production and result in mass famine, starvation, and then, of course, wars to consolidate the dwindling resources that population increasing populations had essentially diminished. And of course, first of all, the two propositions are entirely arbitrarily made. And it was, ironically, it was none other than Karl Marx who pointed this out. He pointed out that, you know, the proposition that population increases geometrically while subsistence production increases only arithmetically. He basically said that, you know, that Thomas Malthus had pulled that out of his hat and everything. That was an entirely spurious set of claims. But nevertheless, Malthusian population control practices would later on be adopted by socialist totalitarian regimes, by the Soviet Union, but ultimately the real true purpose of population control is not some concern for environmental degradation that's supposedly inextricably linked to human population growth or the preservation of dwindling resources. The true purpose for advancing this notion of carrying capacity is because they are concerned about the capacity of their control. The fewer people mean fewer people to manage and fewer people to control, less
likelihood of a rebellion, of overthrow, and to be forearmed is to be forewarned is to be forearmed, as they say. The neo-Malthusians within the global oligarchical establishment may begin to speak a lot louder here in the near term, because we've, you know, a recession is defined as 2 quarters that, you know, where you've seen a contraction in your gross domestic product. Well, we've already seen a contraction by a solid 1 percentage point, 1 and some change percentage point for this last quarter. You know, if somewhere around in July we hear that, you know, the gross domestic product, that GDP has contracted again, we're officially in a recession. And all. So what we head off to then is the possibility of a depression, and the depression is understood as being as production being below what you are capable of, being below your potential. So if production is coming in low, the neo-Malthusians will say, well, look, production has slowed and population is still high. And so, you know, we'll be back to this whole idea of population reduction. They might begin pressing that very hard again.
Gotcha. And did you ever find any connection between Weishaupt, the Rothschilds, and Jacob Frank's Hill Doggy asked?
There's never been anything conclusive. We do know that Rothschild was basically, you know, that in his home, in those home areas, you know, that fell under the Rothschild dynasty, that Masonic lodges were actually allowed there for the first time and whatnot. Nothing, you know, there's suggestions, there's certain, you know, pieces of evidence that seem to suggest it, but nothing conclusive.
And the whole Bible believer woman asks, how do you get people to see that scientism and socialist leaders have pulled the wool over the population's eyes? I hope that's what you meant.
Well, I would say that the first thing that you have to elucidate for people is elucidate for them the fact that science, as it is understood here in the West, is not science. Science is far too vocationally circumscribed, and it's far too limited because of its quantitative and empirical approaches. It has far too many epistemological limitations for it to be applied to questions of governance, to be applied to ethical questions, and to also understand that you know, that this vaunted assessment of science actually results in the destruction of science itself. Science ceases to be science. Science becomes something else. It becomes neo-Gnostic, occultist, mystical nonsense.
Gotcha. And is there anything you'd like to add, or anything I missed before we wrap it up? We're close to about 60 minutes. I mean, there's a lot more in this book.
Maybe a quarter of it. We just go down a rabbit hole, and it would never end. So, like, yeah, I guess that, nothing to add at this time.
Nothing, yeah.
Where's the best place for people to get the Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, the expanded and revised edition, right? You want people to get the updated one.
Right. So when they search for it, they're going to want to search for the 2006 Book Surge edition. Don't search for the 2003 iUniverse edition. That one is way out of date, and it's not nearly even the size of the 2006 edition. The 2006 edition is expanded, it's revised, and it has twice as much information as the 2003 edition. So look for the Book Surge edition.
And I'll put your email in the show notes again if people want to reach out to you. It's thecollinsbros@yahoo.com, right? That's the best place to contact you?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Again, thank you so much for your time. Just a wealth of information and a great book. The title again is The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, an examination of epistemic autocracy from the 19th to the 21st century. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, take care.